Hi, my name is Medhat, and I will be talking about ASP.NET MVC Core. And this is pretty much an introduction into ASP.NET MVC Core. The version of ASP.NET MVC Core that I'm using is version 2.1. So let's have a peek. If I want to know what version I'm using, I would go .NET -- version, and this will tell me that I'm using 2.1.500 preview. This is probably one of the later versions because I'm using Visual Studio Preview here. So in any case, let's get started. So I'm going to create a new folder that I'm going to work in, and I will do one here. And I'm going to create a directory because I'll be using Visual Studio Code, and everything I'll try to do from the command line. So I'm going to create a directory here, and I'll call it ASP Core Primer, and I'll go to that directory. And in this directory, I want to create a new ASP.NET app. So to do that, I would enter .NET new MVC. If you want to know what are the templates that you can create from, you can enter .NET new -- help. And it will tell you some of the various templates that it's got. And the one that I'm interested in is this one here, MVC. That's why I will be entering new MVC. If you want to attach individual database authentication to this, you can do -- authentication auth and type in individual. And this will create a template that uses individual authentication, and when you do it from a command line, it's going to create a SQLite database. But I don't need individual authentication at the moment, so I'm just going to go with this. The name of the app is going to take its name from the folder. So the main app will be called ASP.NET Core Primer. Now, after it creates the template, it does a restore. In essence, what it does is it does a .NET restore. And this is where it actually brings in all the packages, the NuGet packages, and installs them. The other thing that you might want to do is .NET build. And this essentially does a compilation. If you want to run the app, you just go .NET run, and it will run the application. Now, you don't really need to do a build before you do the run, because whenever you do run, it also does a build. So this also includes a build. When you do .NET run, it's going to run the application, and it's going to listen on a port number. And you can access and view the application from the port number. So over here, it says that it's listening on HTTPS on port 5001 and on HTTP port 5000. So let's try and access the site using this port number 5000. So I'm going to go into Chrome and point to this port number, and you will notice that it immediately does a redirect to HTTPS. I may not want that, so I'll tell you how to change it. I'll open my application in Visual Studio Code. So I get this welcome page that I can close, So the last thing that I wanted to change was I don't want this redirect to HTTPS. That is declared in the startup.cs file, which is this one here. If you go to the startup.cs file, there is this command here to use HTTPS redirection. I can comment this out. Okay? I comment this out, and if you set Visual Studio Code to autosave, then you don't really need to save every time you do a change. Going back here, I need to restart the app. Let me stop this and do dotnet run again. And it should rebuild the app. And now that it's rebuilt it, let me try going to port 5000. And now it works. Now, this piece that you see at the top here is basically saying use this space to summarize your privacy and cookie use policy. And typically what you do is you probably click on accept. If you click on home, it goes basically to this URL. If you click on about, it goes to home about. And if you click on contact, it will go to home contact. So the first thing is, let us understand the routing rules that govern how ASP.NET MVC works. And if you want to understand how the routing works, what we need to do is, let's go and look around the directory structure of our application. You will notice that we have a models folder here, we have a controllers folder here, and we have a view folders here. When you're dealing with ASP.NET MVC, it is all about convention. There are certain conventions that you need to follow. All of your views have to go in this directory, under this directory. All of your models have to go under that directory, and all of your controllers are supposed to go under that directory. Now, what are the responsibilities of the controller, the model, and the view? To understand what the responsibilities are, let us open up Paint. So let me just expand this and say we have here the model, and we have here the view, and let's put here the controller. Now, when a request comes in Model View Controller, the request comes to the controller. The controller looks at the request and determines what kind of model is needed to serve or satisfy that request. So the controller says, okay, man, I need this model here. So it chooses a model. After it chooses the model, it passes the model to the view. This is the job of the controller. So the controller chooses a model and gives that model to the view. And the view sends the response to the user. So this is really the architecture that you need to think about. So we can say here that the controller is the recipient of the request and the view is the sender of the response. So let's go back here and let's have a peek at the controller. There's only one controller here. It's called the home controller. If you look at the home controller, it inherits from the controller class. Every controller has to inherit from the controller class. And these methods here, they are what we call action methods. So if we go back and look at the menu items here, we have home, about, contact, and down here we have an action method called index, about, and contact. Let me show you something else. If you go to the startup.cs and scroll to the very bottom, you will see here that there are some routing rules that are declared in the startup.cs. And the routing rules, they basically define the components that make up the URL. The first part of the URL is the controller. The second part is the action method. And then the third part is an optional ID. So now you can look at the URL and determine that this component here is the controller and this component here is the action method. Which means that if I want to get to the index action method, I could have entered index here. It will go to the root. But I do not need to put index because index is the default route. If I just hit enter here, it will go to home index. And that is declared right here. Right here it says that the default controller is home and the default action method is index. Okay? Now if you go back to this home controller, we have 3 action methods that map to the menu items, but actually there is a 4th one here called privacy. Let us see how we can get at privacy. Notice that privacy, there is no menu item here called privacy. But if I want to get to privacy, I can go home/privacy. And it will take me to a page. So it exists. Another thing that you need to know is these action methods, they all must have a view. They all must have a view. And all the views, they exist under this views folder. For every controller, there must be a directory by the name of the controller, and under that controller folder, there are the views for every action method. So notice here, we have 4 action methods, 1, 2, 3, 4. And sure enough, there are 4 pages here, 4 views about contact, index, and privacy. This down here is an action method that's used for errors. So I don't really count it as an action method. It's not something that you can put in a menu. Now, I did mention to you that the job of the controller is to choose a model and pass that model to the view. You can think of this as a model, because what is model? It is some sort of data. So this could be a model that this is here a dictionary type of object. ViewData is a dictionary where this is the key of that dictionary and this is the value. So we're declaring a dictionary with key message and this your application description page. Let me say, I'll change the name. I'll say Medhat application description page. Put my name there just so that you know where it's coming from. Now, if I go to the About view, which is down here, what does this About view do? It declares another dictionary object with key title and value about. This is the way you declare it, and this is the way you display it. So here I'm displaying it using this so-called razor syntax. And razor syntax is wherever you see an at or an at open brace, this is called razor syntax. Here I'm displaying the contents of this particular dictionary, the value. So it's going to display about here using header 2. And then it's going to display ViewData message. Where is that coming from? Message is coming from the controller. Notice here, message. So these objects, you could think of them as the glue between the controller and the view. If you want to pass data from the controller and the view, one way of doing it is putting it into a dictionary object. So down here, it's going to display this message coming from the controller, and then it's just going to put in some text here. So now, if I save this and I refresh, notice that if you're not touching the C# file, you can refresh and it will take. But if you're touching the C# file, you have to recompile and rebuild. Since I changed the controller, I have to rebuild. In order to do a rebuild, I have to stop the initial application. Otherwise, it won't know how to override the DLL file. So I go .NET build. I have to rebuild. Now that I rebuild, I do .NET run. And if I refresh here and I go to About, you see it has Medhat application. Now, there are two types of syntaxes that you can use when dealing with this dictionary. One of them is ViewBag. Instead of using ViewData, you can use this so-called thing called the ViewBag. And after the dot operator, you can put whatever name you like. I put the name message. These two are pretty much equivalent. They do the same thing. So now let me stop, rebuild, and rerun. And if I refresh, it does the same thing. So ViewData or ViewBag, they pretty much do the same thing. It's just different syntax, and it's up to you which syntax you like. Another thing that we should look into is under views, there is this shared folder. And in the shared folder, we have files that are shared among different controllers. And there is one special file, and this is the underscore layout.cshtml. This is the template. This is the envelope inside of which different views are injected. And as far as our app is concerned, if we go down here and look at our app, this is the so-called envelope. This is coming from the layout. and this is coming from the layout. And this is being injected into the layout. So if you open up the layout, you will see that in here you have your top level HTML elements. And you have different types of environments. You have the development environment, and this is the non-development environment. So this says include for development, exclude development. So if you're in production, it's going to load these links. And if you're in development, it's going to load these links. Notice here that if you're in development, it's going to load the bootstrap from inside of your app, whereas if you're in production, it's going to bring it in from a content delivery network. The menu system is here. These are the 3 buttons that we saw here, 1, 2, 3. By the way, we should put privacy here too, right? I could put privacy there. At the moment, I won't bother because we are going to do our own controller now. But before we do our own controller, let's say we create an action method. Where do you do the action method? You would create it in its controller file. So I would come into my controller file. I'm going to close this for the moment. And in my controller file, I want to create a new action method. So I'm going to copy this. Come here. Okay. So I have to change the name. So let me call it bogus. I have an action method called bogus. And then let me put a text here saying the action method called bogus. And instead of ViewData, I'm going to create another, I'm going to create a ViewBag, and I'll call it something else. Let me call it ViewBag and call it just bogus too. Doesn't matter. Now let me run this. And it will give me an error because I haven't created a view for this action method. But let's see what error it's going to give me. So in order to find out, let us stop this, rebuild, and run. I'll come here and go to that destination, which is home bogus. And you will see that it's displaying an error message and saying, I'm looking for this view. Under home, I couldn't find it. Under shared, I couldn't find it. Under pages, I couldn't find it. There's another folder called pages. In here, we don't have pages, but there is another technology called Razor Pages, where it is not really based on model view controller. So it's looking for it and it can't find it. So let us actually create it. So I'm going to go under views and home, and I'm going to copy one of these and I'll paste it and repurpose it. So instead of about one, I'm going to rename it to bogus. Okay. So now I have this bogus page, and then maybe the title should be bogus. And I'm not going to display this message key because I actually created one called bogus too. Because the change I made is in the view, I don't need to recompile because I didn't touch C#. So let me come here, refresh, and you see it works. The action method called bogus. My new action method has a view, and it's got an action method, and it's in the controller, in the right controller, so it works perfectly well. Let's do something a little bit better than that. Let's create a new controller. So I'm going to come to controller here and add a new class called process controller .cs. And this has to be a class, a public class named process controller, and it should inherit from the controller class. Okay, and let us resolve this. So now that is resolved. Let's create an action method here. And this should return a view. So this is exactly the signature of an action method. There is a reason why I called my controller process controller, because there is one thing I want to show you. I want to generate the data that pertains to the processes that are running on my operating system. If you go in a Windows machine to PowerShell and you execute a command called get process, it's going to display for you all the processes that are running in Windows. If you're on the Mac or on Linux, there are similar commands that allow you to see all the processes that are running on the operating system. So this is what I want to display. I want to display the process name and the ID. I could also display a bunch of other properties. And not all the properties are displayed here. There are more properties to a process than the ones displayed here. But for our purposes, these two are more than enough, just for demonstration purposes. So what I want to do here is, I'm going to use a namespace called system diagnostics. Using system.diagnostics. And there is a class called process that allows me to get all these processes. So if I go say process dot get processes, okay, this, if you look at it, it returns an array of process objects. So why don't I do this? Why don't I say process, this is the return type, p equals to process.get processes. Now why don't I hand this model, this to me is a model, it's data. I'm going to hand this over to the view and let the view display this. So I'm going to put this in a ViewBag. ViewBag dot processes equals to p, and then I'll call the view. Now I need to create a view for this action method. Notice that it belongs to a controller called process controller. This means that under views, I must have another folder by the name of the controller called process. So I'm going to come here and create a new folder, which I'll call process. And in this folder, I have to create an index.cs HTML file by the name of the action method. This is the convention. So in the process folder, I'm going to create a new file called index.cs HTML. Now I can display my model. To make it easier on me, I'm just going to copy one of these. and put it into my new index page. So the title of my index page is going to be OS processes. So the title is going to be displayed here, and remember that in my controller I created a dictionary item called processes, so I can retrieve it here. Now if I retrieve it here, it's not going to look good. But let's see what's going to happen. I want to iterate through these process objects and display them. But let's go in here and see what we have achieved so far. So I have to do a build and a run. Let me go back here. So in order to get to that action method, I have to enter here process/index, or just process, because index is default. So let's do that. I'm just going to come in here and type in process and hit enter. You see, it came to that page, but then it's showing me something that is nonsensical here. This is totally nonsensical. We need to display this array, the contents of that array. So let's come back here and say, for example, look, anything that you see between this and this is an area where you can code any C#. You can put in any C# code, and I'll prove that to you. So for the moment, let us just comment this out. And let's look at something else. Suppose I declare an array of names here. So I can say string array names equals to Tom, Bob, Jane, and Judy. So these are a bunch of names. I can iterate through those names using some razor syntax. And the razor syntax is this. Let us say I'll create an unordered list here, and then a line item here. So to display all these names, I'm going to use a razor syntax using the for each command. So let's save this and refresh. And sure enough, it works. Okay? So instead of displaying these names, we have an array of processes. Let us display that array. Remember that when you shove something into a dictionary, it becomes an object and you don't know what kind of object it is. But because we are the programmers, we know that this is a collection of process objects. What's in there is an array of process objects. So we can cast it to what it is. So let's cast it to what it is. So I'm going to comment this out, and let me cast my processes from the dictionary and put it into a real array of processes. Okay, so there you go. We got all the objects representing the processes that are happening in our operating system. Now, there's another way to pass on data from your controller to your view. And that is using something called a concrete class. Why do people like to use concrete classes? The answer to that is because it helps you with IntelliSense when you pass a concrete class. It's a bit more elegant. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you another way of passing data from your controller to your view. And in order to do that, I'm going to create another controller, and I'll call it process one controller, just so it has a different name. So I'm going to copy this here. Sorry, I'm going to copy this process controller, copy, and paste it under controllers. And this second one, I'm just going to call it process one, so it's different. And of course, I have to call the class process one controller. I have to create a folder under views called process one too. So let me fix that also under views. So under views, I'm going to take this process controller, I'm going to copy it and then paste it here. So now I have this process one, which I need to rename just to process without the dot. Let me stop the website and let's have a peek at my process one controller. The other way to pass a concrete class to the view is to avoid these dictionaries altogether, to take that model object and pass it as an argument to the view, like this. Basically put a P here. I'm shipping this to the view as a concrete class. Now, if I go to the view itself, the view for this is process one index. I said I'm not going to be using these view bags anymore, or dictionaries. Instead, if you're using a concrete class, you have to declare a model here that defines the type of class that is being passed as a concrete class from the controller to the view. And I know it is of type I, enumerable, which means it's a collection of system.diagnostics dot process objects. I have to declare this. It has to know what kinds of objects is going to come in. Now that I've told it that this is my model, when I iterate through it, I can iterate through it with this keyword called model with a big M. With a big M, it means it is the model. So, let us rebuild and run this app. .NET build and .NET run. Let me go back to this page here, but I don't want to go to process, I want to go to process one. And notice the same result, no difference. Let us do something. Notice that we don't have this in the menu system. Let me add two buttons here, one for process, one for process one. And where would you do that? You would do that in the layout.cshtml, because that is the template, and that's where the menu system is. So I would go down to the shared folder, and in the shared folder there is this layout.cs HTML, and here it is. I want to repurpose two of these, so I'm going to copy this, paste and paste. Now for the first one, the controller is called process, and the action method is index. And what I want to be displayed is simply the word process. The second one, the controller is process 1. The action method is index, and I wanted to display process 1. Now let me refresh. I have these here. I have two buttons. One goes to process and one goes to process 1. And you can see from there it's doing the right thing. Wouldn't it be nice if I could click on one of these and it would give me the details? That'd be nice, right? There is a helper function that allows you to create a link without using HTML. And I'll show you how that works. So back in the view for process 1, over here, instead of this, I'm going to delete this. So if you want to create a link, you would use this HTML action link helper method, pass it the name of your process. This argument represents the action method that it's supposed to go to in the same controller. This has to do with routing, and here is where you actually pass the ID as the last component in the URL. So if we refresh here, you will see that each one of these have a link where the first part is the controller, the second part is the action method, and we know that this action method details doesn't exist yet because we didn't create it, and the last part here is an ID that's being passed as the third part of the URL. If I click on this, I'll get a 404 because that page doesn't exist yet. The action method doesn't exist. So now let us create that action method. It has to be in the same controller. So I'm going to come back here under process 1. I will have to create a view called details. So let me just create a new file called details.cshtml. But let's not forget that we have to create an action method in the controller too. So let's go to the process 1 controller and create an action method. And the action method, it will have a similar signature to this. So I'm going to do this. And of course it should be called details because that's what I said its name is. And there's an argument that it receives. There's an ID. And so I can say int ID because this is going to be passed to my action method. This action method returns a view. Okay, so now I have an ID here and I want to be able to retrieve a specific ID from the collection. So I can use this object, the process object, process dot, and then you can use this function get process by ID and pass it the ID. And remember that this returns a process object. So I can say, okay, this would return a process object P. I can pass this process object as a concrete class to the view. So I can stick it in here and do that. Which means in the view, I should declare as a model declaration here what kind of object to expect. So I can put a @model and tell it that it should expect a system dot diagnostics dot process object. Okay, now the remaining stuff here, maybe I can repurpose some of these. I'll take some of these, copy it over and repurpose it. So the title, we're just gonna say details, and this is going to display that. Below, I'll say below are details of the selected process. And there is no for each. To be honest, this can go because I don't have a collection. I have one process being passed here. So I can say H3, the name is @model.process name. And I can copy this. The ID is model.id. Okay. So now let us stop, build, and run. And let's go back here. Let me refresh this and let me click on one of these services, and sure enough I was able to get the details for that service. Go to another one, I get a different detail. There are more properties that you can show here. So these are the basic principles that govern how an ASP.NET MVC app works using .NET Core. Thank you for watching this video, and I hope to see you again.